I like to imagine she dressed for the occasion, Constance.
Yeah.
That red dress, that's a choice.
Bold red lip.
She didn't even do anything wrong.
It still hurts my heart so much that she just went right for the maid. Just like, you obviously don't want this, but I'm gonna kill you anyway.
I've loved you since I was 16. You've broken my heart for the last
At this point, she must not know that people who die in this house stay in this house.
Maybe not. Yeah, I think you're right.
Also, how did she get the gunshot right into the eyeball? How was that shot so good?
Right?
Well, I am pregnant. I am just horrified for you and your family. I hardly know what to say.
Marcy is a national treasure.
Imagine how you might be feeling a little anxious given all of this. Not anxious, angry. Move on, Missy. A hell of a shot. I'm at the end of my rope.
Adina Porter.
Supposed to sign the papers next week.
I kind of forgot that she was
3 years gone with the
in the first season.
I'm so upset.
Change your mind? No. No. Told you I ain't no faggot. It's not what your dick says.
You know, every time I watch this episode, it crosses my mind to look up if this is a true story, because I would imagine it is, and I want to know more.
Easy, man. You were cruising me.
I mean, how would you... Do they tell you their names? Like...
Salminio was 37 years old when he died. Golden Globe winner and two-time Oscar nominee. His father was a coffin maker who never accepted that his son was gay.
I might have to talk about him.
He's adding wings to the pig, isn't he?
You've ruined it.
I think it looked fine, Charles. For the abomination that it is, it has 2 heads.
Don't be so hard on yourself.
Well, kind of thinking on that topic, I think it would be interesting to learn more about Frankenstein doctors.
Ooh, that's a good one.
You think I came all the way here from Philadelphia for this? Oh, good, Charles. Break everything. Then we're gonna run a quick EKG and a blood panel. Make sure.
I would have to be like, no, stop. My health insurance will not cover any of that. Please don't take anything out of my body.
I'm fine.
I don't know about you, but I do not have the gusto to do an impromptu gazebo. I don't have that kind of motivation to
On
be...
any given day.
Yeah, like, I'm just gonna build a gazebo today. You know?
That was a nightmare. This place is the nightmare. I love her house. It's got soul.
It's got lots of souls. Grab that candlestick. I love this lady.
She's incredible. She's an icon. A doctor's woman. What the fuck is going on with this family?
Constance has a wiener dog.
I think I'm going to talk about that guy. I want to look into that story.
I kind of want to know more about real-life Frankenstein doctors.
It's a filthy goddamn horse show.
Welcome to It's a Filthy Goddamn Horror Show, a trivia variety show for and by American Horror Story fans, where we take a sidewinding journey through topics inspired by episodes of American Horror Story. This is my soulmate, someone that I connect to him on such a deep emotional level. This is Nathan Scathway.
And this is my constant companion, and for several years, the core of my emotional well-being. Monique Quistorf.
So, after watching this week's episode of American Horror Story, I was inspired to watch The Reanimator, which is a 1985 film directed by Stuart Gordon, which is loosely based on the 1922 H.P. Lovecraft serial novelette called Herbert West, Reanimator. So, I think it's important maybe to talk about my process of deciding movies, unless I can find a movie in my research.
Mm-hmm.
I have a partner who is basically a walking encyclopedia for everything, but especially films and horror films specifically. So I just said, you know what? I need this week, I need a Frankenstein doctor kind of movie. And he's like, right here, this is what we watch, here we go. And have you seen The Reanimator before, Nathan?
I have never seen The Reanimator before.
Okay. In it's apparently a cult classic.
That's what I've heard.
So, and I get it. So it's hard for me to critique it because it's like I understand like why it has generated a cult following.
Yeah, but I think it's also okay and maybe also kind of central to the cult fandom idea to like be willing to openly criticize the movies. They're all their own level of bad usually. It's just in such a way that it endears people. So I feel like most cult classics are movies that like the people who love them fully recognize the flaws. So I don't think you're gonna upset anybody, and I feel like you could talk pretty openly about it.
Well, there are movies where where I'm able to really look at the emotional piece of it, or even the fear, like its ability to actually insinuate fear in people. This movie, I was so distracted by the plot holes, by there's. How much of this am I going to give away to you?
You can give away as much as you want. I'm not particularly precious about spoilers unless it's like a long-running TV show that I'm really invested in.
So it's this young doctor who, apprentices this doctor who studies death, and he creates this reanimation agent, right? That he injects into like. Electrifies the body to the point where the intestines squirt out and wrap around the scientist's neck and strangle him to death. I'm like, what is this?
Wow,
What is this?
I mean, you said 85 is when it came out?
Yes.
It's the body horror genre, which specifically exploits bodily gore and transformation and I guess to a certain degree mutilation, but usually like transformation and just weird, bizarre, extreme things happening to bodies was huge back then. Even before that, I'm thinking of have you seen The Thing, the original John Carpenter movie The Thing with Kurt Russell?
I don't think so.
It seemed like there was a time where the goal of that particular genre of horror anyway was how far can we push the special effects and what ridiculous physical things can we put the human body through to make our audience uncomfortable?
Oh yeah. I mean, that was definitely apparent. I think I've obviously been desensitized to the very graphic, insidious like body horror that we get now with CGI and other just really deep-seated. I struggle with body horror. I have such strong empathy that I literally cannot disconnect myself. Mm-hmm. But this movie made it very easy. There's maybe like one or two times where I was like, this is a movie, Monique. It's okay. Like, I think anytime anything happens to a face where I'm like, no, like eyeballs squishing, I'm like, I'm good, I gotta go. It followed the trope perfectly. I don't know how politically correct it is to talk about H.P. Lovecraft in this day and age, even though he was a very strong influencer of the American horror genre. But I was really interested to kind of watch something that was influenced by his work as well. That's something I feel like I've had pretty minimal exposure to in general. My topic of the week is mad scientists. We see in the episode we see kind of the show's first introduction to its darkness. It revolves around this doctor who is unfortunately getting high on his own supply and melting his brain a little bit, and he's stitching bat wings onto pigs and keeping dismembered body parts in jars, and then later in the story providing other services. But I wanted to look more into where this mad scientist trope started, both in literature and cinema. Mm-hmm. and also learn a little bit more about mad scientists in our actual history. Surprise, surprise, the first kind of instance, or like the prototypical fictional mad scientist, was Victor Frankenstein. brought to us in the 1818 novel Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley. Even in the movie that I watched, The Reanimator, in this episode of American Horror Story, in probably every single trope that you can find of the mad scientist, there is this critical element of conducting experiments or furthering research that cross boundaries that should not be crossed. We see a little bit of that in the next season, in Asylum. And there's almost always this bridge between two eras of like the evolving archetype. I mean, even if we think about Dr. Montgomery in American Horror Story is a primary care provider. He's a licensed MD. He later provides perfectly safe, well, hopefully perfectly safe, but routine medical procedures that are a part of everyday general health. And in his free time, he is sewing wings onto pigs. So there's just like the kind of that dichotomy of being like a master in your craft, but also having these really kind of outlandish, crazy ideas about science. Other, prevalent depictions of mad scientists in literature would be H.G. Wells's The Island of Dr. Moreau, which was published in 1896. And that story is about a doctor who's isolated himself from civilization to continue his experiments in reshaping animals into humanoid forms. So I've not read that book.
There are also, there's at least one movie adaptation starring Vincent Price, I think. That might be wrong.
I'm always impressed by the amount of just specific information you can keep in your brain.
And the normal things that I can't hold in their place. Yeah.
In cinema, Metropolis, directed by Fritz Lang, came out in 1927, which depicts a scientist named Rot Wang, who is an evil genius whose machines gave life to the dystopian city. I learned a lot about how this specific movie became kind of the foundation for the mad scientist trope for all other movies moving forward. So the laboratory in this movie, influenced future movie sets with the array of dials and controls, bubbling beakers, electrical arcs. Even how the scientist looks in this movie, like having like the flyaway crazy hair, wild eyes, just kind of that stark laboratory uniform. I mean, it was echoed in Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, which came out in 1964. It's just really interesting to like, part of like what we get to do too is kind of learn how the American horror genre is influenced, and just kind of curious to find like where those things start and where they came from. Because like now even if you think of like Back to the Future, like Doc, that's what he looked like. And he is technically a mad scientist, but not nearly as gruesome as what we're talking about today, or in any episode that would ever, of American Horror Story, we would ever talk about. But I thought this was really interesting. I got an interesting fact that a survey of 1,000 horror films distributed in the UK between the 1930s and the 1980s revealed that mad scientists or their creations have been the villain of 30% of films, while only being heroes in 11% of films. Another really interesting kind of tidbit of information that I came on that made a lot of sense is that after World War II, mad scientists became a much more obvious trope in horror after the human experimentation conducted by Joseph Mengele in the Nazi Party and the invention of the atomic bomb. These everyday real-life horrors provided legitimacy in the genuine fears of the general public that science and technology had gone out of control at that point. So we saw a lot more of the mad scientist trope after that era. But now I can tell you a little bit more about real-life mad scientists. The first one I'm going to talk about is one that I had learned about before, and I guess I can't remember where, for the life of me, I learned about it, if it was my own research, if it was, other like sources of media that specifically talk about horror that I've just absorbed and retained. But Giovanni Aldini was born in Bologna, Italy on April 10th, 1762, so a long time ago. This man was alive. And he died in Milan, Italy on January 17th, 1834. He was a professor of physics at Bologna in 1798. His work focused mainly on galvanism and the medical applications of galvanism. And galvanism is the generation of electrical current by chemical action, or the generation of electrical current within biological organisms and the electrical stimulation of biological muscle tissue upon contact with an electric current.
Good God.
So it's, it's we are electric beings, right?
Yeah.
So it's just the process of applying that electricity to our bodies. I think it's also important to note that his uncle was Luigi Galvani, who essentially discovered galvanism.
So coming in with a reputation to...
Yeah, there was maybe some nepotism, I don't know. But his uncle, Luigi Galvani, experimented on frogs, where Giovanni Aldini experimented with corpses. So there was, just kind of a one-upping. Just that's where a person's mind would go, I guess, is I want to see how this works on dead bodies.
Oh my God. You're going to electrocute some frogs. Hold my beer.
He wasn't like such a dastardly mad scientist, though. His work also involved the construction of illumination of lighthouses and experiments for preserving life and material objects from destruction by fire. So he did some other things that didn't involve directly disgracing dead bodies. But so the story that I remember, that you might remember when I tell it to you, is his most famous public demonstration of the electrostimulation technique. This was performed on the executed criminal George Forster at Newgate, London in 1803. So this was a man who was just hung for murdering his wife and child. And of course, it's the 1800s. This experiment is being done in front of a crowd. There's an audience. So he applied conducting rods to George Forster's rectum, which caused the dead man's arms to punch the air and his legs to kick. Conducting rods were applied to his face, which made it clench and quiver, and his left eye even opened. And there was like a fear, because his body looked so lifelike when he was applying. There was even like a note of the possibility that the body had taken a breath, like it sounded or it looked as though it had inhaled or exhaled. And the audience that was watching suddenly became concerned that they were going to have to re-execute this man because Giovanni Aldini brought him back to life, which obviously he did not. But it was such a shocking performance that an audience member reportedly died shortly after watching this performance. Which was kind of the reason I wanted to include this in the episode, because when I got to that, I was like, people can die of anything. People can die at any moment for anything. But I just think it's really interesting that it's notable enough, 200 years later, we're still talking about the guy who died after he watched this. Like it's still in the lore.
Yeah.
So I was very intentional about the mad scientists I chose to include in the episode today. I think all of the scientists I read about were not senseless acts of like gore and horror. It was, old white men somehow deciding that they were going to do something gruesome to a living or a dead creature, human or animal. But I wanted to intentionally kind of veer away from that gruesomeness. But I wanted to specifically continue to talk about this curious, just like, I think like sometimes the idea of a mad scientist is just like, obviously someone who pushes the boundaries and, kind of goes into that area that we as a society have decided like, nope, we're not doing that. That's too far. And it's just so curious to me that there are people who are like, no, I am going to toe that line. I am going to kind of go over there and see what that's all about and try these horrific, unimaginable things on myself or other beings. And it furthers science. Even when we think about like Giovanni Aldini, like we learned things about the human body that we had never known before. And those things greatly benefit us now. Or, benefit our medical practices now. So I'm going to talk about a mad scientist maybe I shouldn't call him a mad scientist because he is in our current world. He is alive and well, and has made some interesting discoveries in some very recent years, which is why I wanted to include him, because I was like, this is crazy. I've never heard of this, and we need to talk about it. His name is Kevin Warwick. He was born in Coventry, England on February 9th, 1954. So this man has done a lot. He's done research in artificial intelligence, biomedical engineering, control systems, and robotics. He's also contributed to mathematics, power engineering, and manufacturing production machinery. So he's not just a scientist pushing the boundaries. He has a very hot take on technology. He argues that humanity will need to use technology to enhance itself to avoid being overtaken by machines, which makes me anxious. Yeah, there's a little bit of anxiety in that.
Love it.
Yeah. He talks about the many human limitations, like sensory motor abilities, and how these abilities can be outdone by machines. And he has said on the record that he wants to gain these abilities that the machines have. And he said, there's no way I want to stay a mere human. Direct quote from this man. There's work that he's currently doing now. So he's helping to design the next generation of deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease. So, instead of like stimulating the brain all the time, he's creating technology that will sense when the brain needs to be stimulated to prevent, like a tremor or a shake or an episode, and can stop them before they even start. Like that's what he's working on right now. He's also done, I told you before, like one of the things that he's known for, that he has done research on, is robotics, and we've already kind of talked a little bit about how he feels about us mere humans. He has created robots that have exhibited behavior that has not been anticipated by research. He's made a robot that has committed suicide, a robot that actively killed itself because it could not cope with its environment, which is horrifying. But whatever situation that robot was in, it chose to self-destruct. There's more in like the work that he's doing with robots that is just like, it's unsettling. He got into the Guinness Book of World Records for performing the first robot learning experience using the internet. Now, let me explain. He made a robot that he taught how to move around without bumping into things. And then that robot taught another robot using the internet how to do the same thing. So
robots could potentially teach themselves anything from the internet now, or teach each other things from the internet?
Yes.
No.
So this is where his like mad scientistry comes in. There's something that he has worked on that's called Project Cyborg. So the first stage began on August 24th, 1998, which is a long time ago. If I think about our scientific technological advances to even consider the word cyborg.
Yeah.
So the first stage involved a simple RFID transmitter being implanted beneath his skin. So he was his own test subject in this situation. And this transmitter could be used to control doors, lights, heaters, and other computer-controlled devices based on his proximity. So he could use this chip that he implanted in his skin to it's basically what we could do with our phones now, and like Google, or Alexa. But he has a thing, he put a thing in his skin in 1998. So the main purpose of this experiment was to test the limits of what the body would accept and how easy it would be to receive a meaningful signal from the microprocessor. The second stage included a device consisting of a brain gate sensor, a silicon square about 3 millimeters wide, connected to an external machine that housed supporting electronics. This device was implanted on March 14th, 2002, which is it's still very recent, but still so far away now that I'm like, how? And this device was interfaced directly into his nervous system, and it was put in via the median nerve on his left wrist. So this experiment was successful, and they were able to use this technology to mimic the actions of Warwick's own arm and transmit that to a robot arm. So whatever he did in his arm, the robot hand would do. And it did it, like, he wasn't in the same room. It did it through internet. Well, I guess we had internet in 1998, but it was so different then. It was so different. I'm still like, his nervous system was connected to the internet at Columbia University. From there, he was able to control the robot arm at the University of Reading and obtain feedback from sensors in his fingertips. So they were not in the same place, and his arm with the machine, with the chip he had implanted in his hand, would control the robot arm in a totally different place because of the internet. A simpler device was implanted in the arm of his wife, with the ultimate aim of one day creating a form of telepathy or empathy using the internet to communicate the signal over huge distances. So this experiment resulted in the first direct and purely electronic communication between the nervous systems of two humans. So they were afraid, the original fear when they did this was that they were afraid that the technology connected directly to the nervous system might cause some damage or interference, but there was no side effect, no sign of rejection, and actually it was observed that the nerve tissue grew around the technology, enclosing the sensor. So the body accepted it.
That's crazy.
Again, I'm like, how?
That's like some Star Wars shit.
Exactly. And had you ever heard of that before? Did you even know about that? No.
No. No idea. This man is doing wild sci-fi things just in the present day, and I had no idea.
I mean, the last, I guess, documented progress that was made, it's the early 2000s. So I'd be kind of curious to know, like, what's been going on since then? Has the government, like, full stopped you? Like, has the government just been like, you can't do any more of this, please be done?
Or were they like, now you're going to do this for us?
Yeah, like, ooh, we like what you're doing, and we have some different, more centralized ideas of how we would like you to spend your mental energy. Which, again, doesn't make me feel any more safe.
No.
I'm not any more comforted by that.
I think on that note, we are gonna take a real quick commercial break. Stick with us, and we'll be back right after this brief message. As you probably know, we don't do paid ad breaks here at It's a Filthy Goddamn Horror Show. Instead, we plug organizations doing great things with the hope that you'll be inspired to find out more about them and maybe get involved. This week, I'm plugging the Trevor Project, which is focused on benefiting LGBT youth, especially through suicide prevention efforts. It was founded by the creators of an Oscar-winning short film called Trevor and has since become a huge resource backed by celebrities, political figures, etc. What the Trevor Project does is provide phone, text, and live chat helplines for LGBT youth dealing with thoughts of suicide or self-harm. If you want to support them, you can donate on their site, sign up for updates, and even volunteer to train to become a crisis counselor. It takes 40 hours of training and a year-long commitment, but it's a fantastic opportunity to make a huge difference in the lives of LGBT youth. If that sounds like something you might be interested in, or if you're just interested in donating, all that info and more is available at thetrevorproject.org. So, this week's episode of American Horror Story featured a story which, like I said before, every single time I've watched this episode and it gets to this part, I always want to look up more about this guy, and I've never done it before. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about Sal Mineo. For those of you who have seen American Horror Story, or I guess for those of you who also haven't, in the third episode, Vivian is out in her garden, and the Murder House tour, I believe it's called the Eternal Darkness tour, drives by, and she realizes that her house is on the Murder House tour, so she goes on it, and we briefly get to see one of the other stops where it describes this real-life murder that happened. So, Sal Mineo was an actor, a singer, and a director. He was born January 10th, 1939. As far as acting goes, he was most famous probably for the 1955 film Rebel Without a Cause, which also starred James Dean and Natalie Wood. Mineo was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor and marked I believe he was the 5th youngest at the time, or even to this day, I believe he still holds the record, but 5th youngest to be nominated in that category. After that, he went on to star in Exodus in 1960, which was a Paul Newman film, or a film starring Paul Newman, rather, about the founding of the modern state of Israel. For this, he won the Golden Globe Award for Best Supporting Actor and got his 2nd Oscar nomination, which marks him as, at the age that he was at the time, the youngest actor to receive 2 Oscar nominations by the age of 22. After that, he went on to do Escape from the Planet of the Apes, which is the 3rd film in the original Planet of the Apes trilogy and came out 5 years before he died. And in among that time, he was doing a lot of crime and detective films, some westerns. He beat out Clint Eastwood for a role in 1955, the same year that Rebel Without a Cause came out, in Six Bridges to Cross. And then one of his last roles that he did in 1975 was playing kind of like a Manson-esque cult leader on the TV show SWAT. So he was known kind of for like these detective procedural sort of macho type roles. But in addition to that, he had also come up doing a lot of theater. His mother enrolled him in dancing and acting school when he was really, really young. He did a lot of stage roles in his youth, and even throughout the rest of his life, he continued to direct. He directed an opera in 1972, and then in the 70s, he was facing a bit of a career slump, but was also going through some personal trials because of the fact that, as a lot of people know about Sal Mineo, he was rumored to be gay. He was romantically involved with an English actress named Jill Hayworth. If you're familiar with the Broadway musical Cabaret, she was the original Sally Bowles. But they met on the set of Exodus, and they were even engaged at one point. But Michael Greg Michaud, who's a biographer, who was one of the first people to really kind of shine a light on Mineo's life outside of the fact that he was murdered and all of the stories that have surrounded that, talked about the fact that Hayworth reportedly broke off the engagement when she found Mineo with another man. So they broke off their engagement, but the two remained friends for the rest of their life, although she was often described and has been described to this day as his beard, which for any of our listeners who are not familiar with that term, the implication there is that they were only together as a means of hiding his sexuality at the time.
And that, I mean, does that also imply that she was in on it? Like,
that's a good question. I mean, if Michaud's story is accurate and she walked in on him with another man, I would imagine that maybe she wasn't in on it, but they did remain friends. So I would say maybe it got to a point where there was no hard feelings. Maybe she was understanding. I'm not sure. But in 1972, he actually discussed his sexuality, which one of the common misconceptions about him is that he was gay, but he was actually bisexual, and discussed his bisexuality in an interview with Bose Hadley in Hadley's book Conversations with My Elders in 1972, in which he talked openly about the fact that he was bisexual and was in a relationship with another actor, a male actor named Courtney Burr III, which he was still in at the time of his death. So he spoke openly about his sexuality during a time where that was not really something that people did. And a lot of people have attributed that to sort of the downturn in his career.
well, let alone, I mean, obviously there was a challenge and continues to be a challenge of talking about any sexuality in general, but I feel like during that time, and even today, it's more acceptable to be gay or straight. But to be openly bisexual, you know, a lot of people even today perceive bisexuality as a stepping stone or an excuse to be with whoever you want to be. So, I mean, even just thinking about then his relationship with Jill Hayworth, you know, maybe she knew he was bisexual and he cheated on her.
That's true. That's very possible.
It's not like, you know, I mean, I think that would be a much more plausible explanation as to why that relationship ended than he was not straight, but that he was having sexual intercourse with someone who was not her, and that was not agreed upon.
Yeah. Although it was throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and potentially even a little bit later, it was not uncommon for Hollywood actors who were gay to be deeply closeted, and even in some cases in sort of like show relationships, basically just for the sake of keeping up appearances. So unfortunately, this brings us to Minio's death. On February 12th, 1976, Minio was returning home from rehearsals for P.S. Your Cat is Dead. He parked his car in the carport below his apartment, which was in West Hollywood, where he was promptly attacked and stabbed by a mugger who fled. This is interesting because it's very different than the depiction that they show on this episode of American Horror Story.
That's what I was thinking.
What they show is kind of the implication that he was cruising or being cruised by another man and then became the victim of a direct gay hate crime at that moment. But what actually happened was that the witnesses that night and just sort of the witness accounts were so varied that the police couldn't immediately figure out exactly what had happened to him or what the motivation might have been. But there's a quote from one of the detectives who was working on it. At the time, he said, "We found out that he was a homosexual. That opened a whole new field. Is this a disgruntled lover? A prostitute that he picked up off the street?" So the fact that Minio was openly not straight at the time led the police, when he was murdered, to immediately assume it had to be something with that, even though it had nothing to do with that. The actual murderer, or at least the man who was arrested for it, his name was Lionel Ray Williams. He was a pizza delivery man and a petty criminal who was tried and sentenced for the murder in 1979. He got 57 years because he had committed 10 related robberies in the area. And there was some doubt originally about whether he had even done it or not, but he was later overheard by prison guards bragging about the crime. And apparently when he came home the night of Minio's death, his wife reported that he had blood on his shirt. So they were pretty sure that he did it, but not only did they immediately assume that it was something that had to be motivated by his sexuality, that has been the story that has persisted ever since. People have been kind of stuck on that, and his death is often attributed as a hate crime, when unless something else happened and someone else did it and Lionel Ray Williams was just the person who it was pinned on, it was really just a random crime. But Williams even said that he had no idea who Minio was whenever he attacked him. It was just a random attack. And here it was this 2-time Oscar nominee, Golden Globe winning actor.
Who happened to be bisexual, openly.
Who happened to be bisexual.
And that of course has to push the narrative.
Exactly, but it's especially sad because Michaud talks about the fact that Minio was in the process of trying to revive his career, and he was known for the fact that he was very determined and that he was a hard worker, and probably would have gotten the chance and might have been able to revive his career if this random senseless thing hadn't happened to him.
So it was a robbery gone too far.
That is the official story. That's what the legal result of it was. But like the episode says, there are still a lot of people, especially in the Los Angeles area, who hold on to the story that it was a hate crime, either because they believe that the police covered up that it was a hate crime, or just because that rumor, ironically started by the police, is what has persisted after all these years. So from there, I started thinking a little bit about the fact that his career had taken this downturn when he began to be open about his sexuality, and started to consider what the climate was like specifically for queer culture in Hollywood in the 70s. And from there, started doing a whole bunch of research on queer horror movies from the 70s, which is how I came to the films that I watched this week. I did my very own little double feature, not because I meant to, but because I finished one, heard about the second movie, and was like, I need to watch that. So I watched them back to back. So yeah, I'm just going to talk a little bit about queer horror in the 70s and what that climate was kind of like, and how that sort of mirrors what Mineo was going through at the time, because spoiler alert, 70s weren't a particularly friendly time for queer horror. But the first movie that I watched was the 1970 adaptation of The Picture of Dorian Gray. This one is just called Dorian Gray.
Okay.
It's set in the 70s, and even during the opening titles, it was billed as a modern allegory based on the novel by Oscar Wilde, which, for anybody who is not familiar with Oscar Wilde, famously gay author. And the interesting thing is that in the book, I should probably summarize for anybody who hasn't read Dorian Gray, that the general concept is basically there's this rich, beautiful guy, Dorian Gray, who doesn't age and sort of lives his life for debauchery and beauty and sex. And in the meantime, he has this portrait that ages in his place and sort of shows the deterioration of his soul. And while Dorian is explicitly gay in the book, most adaptations since then have portrayed him as bisexual, interestingly enough, because we were just talking about how bisexuality is oftentimes the harder one for the public eye to accept. But in this case, I almost think that they make that choice based on the misconception and the trope that bisexuals are more sexual and
greedy,
kind of like debauched people, and greedy, exactly, who just kind of sleep with anybody. And that's kind of Dorian's MO, is it's just that he fucks everybody. So I think a lot of adaptations have chosen to make him bisexual because they can kind of make it so he can sleep with anybody he wants, and then it contributes to his sort of wild partying lifestyle. And this particular adaptation, the bisexuality was not as overt as other adaptations, but the movie itself was made with an incredibly queer eye. The way that Dorian's beauty is depicted was extremely homoerotic. The portrait that gets painted of him was hella gay. It shows him shirtless and kind of in like this curvy pose with the low-rise jeans and like a bright pink bandana tied around his neck. Like it's the quintessential 70s gay image. Everybody who meets him is utterly taken with how beautiful he is. There are many, many scenes where they're just like admiring him from afar. There's one where there's like 3 characters all just staring out a window while Dorian showers on a dock outside.
Casual, you know.
Yeah, it's very much done with, I would argue, a very queer perspective on his beauty.
Out of curiosity, I don't know if you mentioned this, but who plays Dorian Gray? Who is this beautiful man?
Dorian Gray in this adaptation is played by one Helmut Berger, who is an Austrian film and television actor, but was apparently known for portraying narcissistic and sexually ambiguous characters. So, right on the money. But other than just being sort of stared at by multiple characters, most of the film's more erotic content was fairly straight, except for one sequence where he was seduced by an older man in the shower while that man's wife is seducing another woman in the next room. So there was just this random sudden scene and where they were basically like, now we're gonna make it gay. And then immediately following that, there's a scene that was basically essentially at a pier and showed Dorian cruising a guy in a bathroom. But that brought me to an interesting point, which is that the scene where he has his shower encounter and then the scene where he is cruising on the pier was immediately followed by a cutaway to the portrait that shows it has decayed significantly. So basically, Dorian is going about his business, partying, having sex with women, doing his thing, and the portrait is decaying a little and a little and a little, but then there's this sequence where he indulges in experiences with men, and suddenly the the decay of his soul is so much more advanced, according to the portrait. Which really brought me to what I was able to hypothesize about queer horror in the 70s, which is that the queerness is almost always used as a source of villainy or as a source of evil, or as a source of moral decay.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the era where queer was a derogatory term. I mean,
Exactly.
wasn't so far after that even terms like "that's so gay" was used as an insult. Mm-hmm. Shortly before that era, I feel like gay was still being used to describe happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And then, almost on a turn of a dime, it was derogatory.
Yeah, exactly. And there was also in portraying homosexuality and just sexualities other than straight as being a source of evil, there was sort of this overarching theme of that evil seducing people, and it specifically being like like the idea that they're gonna turn you gay sort of thing.
Like it's predatory.
Exactly, like it's a predatory sort of thing. That was very apparent in another film that came out in 1970, which is the one that I decided I had to watch. It is called The Vampire Lovers. It is an adaptation of the Sheridan Le Fanu novel Carmilla, which was written in 1872, and it is a lesbian vampire film.
Hell yeah.
It was made by Hammer Horror, which is this studio that was in London from the 50s through the 70s and was known for sort of campy, very dramatic horror. Like if you think of Vincent Price movies from the 70s, or just those general sort of very cheesy painted sets, over the top, very red blood, like the really cheesy horror from the 70s, and a lot of times gothic horror from the 70s. They did a lot of Edgar Allan Poe movies. But Hammer Horror produced this. It had Peter Cushing, who, if any of our listeners are familiar with Star Wars, he played Tarkin. And it actually set off a trend of lesbian vampire movies in the 70s. There was The Daughters of Darkness. There was a Spanish film called The Blood Spattered Bride. But this became a trope in the 70s, was lesbian vampire movies. And the plot structure, like most vampire films, essentially followed Dracula, but in this case it was a female vampire seducing and turning
Wow.
Other women.
That's a very pointed, wow.
Exactly.
Subtlety is not their strong suit.
Yeah, there were actually 2 other films in the series that came out. Both of them came out the following year, so they were right quick. They were like, we gotta follow this up. But those 2 weren't as overtly queer as the first one. But moving on into the 70s, that particular theme of villainizing the queer aspect of a character, or villainizing just the queer aspect of a story, only got worse. There was the film Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, which came out in 1971, and obviously was an adaptation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but the Hyde character was a feminine personality. To be honest, the film is wildly transphobic and homophobic. It doesn't really address any queer implications of a male and a female personality in one body, but instead presents the Sister Hyde personality as a problem, in that she's trying to override Dr. Jekyll's heterosexuality by killing the women in his life that he's attracted to.
So the woman personality wants him to be gay.
Essentially, or at least just wants to take over, essentially. And be the primary, which I think is generally the plot of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, is that Hyde wants full control of the body. I actually found this interesting quote from Peter Hutchings in Hammer and Beyond, the British horror film, where he describes the changing role of women in horror in the 70s as the transformation of women from passive object to problem subject. So pre-70s, women especially were passive objects, victims, just basically there to be rescued or become a victim of something. Whereas in the 70s, the shift kind of happened and they became more of the problem and the source of evil. But this later becomes even more pointed and even more negative with Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left, which came in 1972 and is arguably probably one of the most negative depictions of same-sex activity in a horror movie at the time, in which it's a forced sexual act between two characters and used as a form of torture. So it's really just there to provide horror. And that is sort of the overarching impression that I got from most 70s queer horror, is that it's always there as the source of darkness and the source of horror. And one of the first times that almost gets turned on its head is with the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which is outdated. We all know is a little outdated at this point in terms of how it deals with gender identity and queer issues, but it remains a cult classic and a staple even in the queer community. But it was one of the first times that it brought aspects of queer culture, even if not necessarily accurate to reality, to the mainstream and to sort of like a cult classic status. But even in that, Frankenfurter's the villain. The character who canonically cross-dresses is still the villain of the story. So overall, the 1970s were not a particularly friendly place for queer characters in horror. Specifically, it was a rough time.
It's that queerness being used as a tool to further the plot of horror or the plot of villainy. And I mean, we were talking earlier just to kind of about that change of the way that mainstream media portrayed queerness, that definitely shaped and molded the way that the general population looked at queerness. And I think, I mean, I'm not a sociological expert in any way, but I feel like that would be interesting to look at the contribution then of this fervent, toxic masculinity that we have been so actively, well, a certain portion of us are so actively fighting and challenging at this point. How much of that fed into where we are right now? Well, I think it's time for a twist ending.
Yes, twist ending. Let's go.
What I would like to talk about this week is dissociative fugue, otherwise known or previously referred to as fugue states. So in this episode, we see Ben, once again, not being a great therapist. I guess this time it's not quite his fault. He's being controlled, manipulated by Moira, who desperately wants him to find her dead body. So in this case, this wouldn't be considered dissociative fugue because there's an obvious external factor influencing him. But in the real world, if this were happening to somebody, it would be considered dissociative fugue. So it is a dissociative disorder. It's a rare disorder characterized by reversible amnesia for personal identity, including memories, personality, and other identifying characteristics of individuality. It's typically caused by a series of long-term traumatic episodes. It would not be considered dissociative fugue if it were caused by psychotropic substances, physical trauma, a general medical condition, or an actual dissociative identity disorder, or dementia. So if there's another diagnosis or a thing you can actually point to that would be influencing a person's mental state, it would not be dissociative fugue. And unlike what's portrayed here in this episode, he's in the fugue for a couple hours, maybe, and not for very long, but typically the dissociative fugue can last days, months, or even longer. There are stories about people who've vanished and were found 6 months later living in Alaska under a different name, and still had not left that dissociative fugue and didn't know who they were originally. So it typically lasts much longer than what's portrayed in this episode. A dissociative fugue usually involves unplanned travel or wandering, and is sometimes accompanied by the establishment of a new identity. A doctor might suspect that someone has dissociative fugue when they seem confused about their identity or are puzzled about their past, or when confrontations challenge their new identity or absence of one. And sometimes this condition can't be diagnosed until they come back to their original identity and can say, I have no idea how to account for this time. I have no idea what happened. I don't know how I got here, because when you're in that fugue and you've established a new identity, what other people are telling you are not lining up with the reality that you've established. But when people do recover from dissociative fugue, previous memories usually return intact and no further treatment is necessary.
Well, I'm going to educate these fine people about the opening titles of American Horror Story. The opening titles of the show are created by Kyle Cooper, who is a film title designer who owns a company called Prologue in Los Angeles. He's famous for the opening titles to the movie Seven, Dawn of the Dead, even Home Alone, which he created while he was working at a different company. But he was contracted to work on the season before they had even started shooting, because Ryan Murphy was familiar with his work on Seven and was like, I want something like this. I want this guy. So Kyle Cooper came on board, began with the type design, which he chose after visiting the Rosenheim mansion where they were shooting the pilot. The type design is a font called Charles Rennie Mackintosh, and it was specifically inspired by the Art Deco design of the Rosenheim mansion. So the branding that has become famous for American Horror Story was specifically inspired by the way that the murder house looks and the type of architecture that is apparent in it, and the fonts and typefaces that are sort of associated with that period. The interesting light quality that you see in these opening credits were created by Cooper himself, running around the basement of a theater, which is where they actually filmed the opening. It's not the basement of the house. It was filmed in the basement of a theater, shooting on a Super 16 film camera while the lighting people essentially just tried to keep up. So what's happening is he's going around the basement shooting all of these creepy shots, and the lighting person is following him, trying to point that light, which is why you sort of get this feeling of being pursued in the opening credits. Like the light sort of seems like it's trying to catch up with you, and it's never quite illuminating what's in the shot, or only for a second, because he was moving around so fast that they were literally just trying to keep up. And then another interesting fact that I found is that the beat in the song originally comes from distorted coat hangers being clashed together. Art of the Title, which is a website that I frequent quite often. I'm exposing my nerdiness here, but it is a great website that is entirely devoted to the design of opening and closing title sequences for movies and TV, and they often do features where they interview the designers and talk about how they were made. So there's this, I have to recommend it for anybody who enjoys the opening credits of American Horror Story. There's this amazing feature that they did where they interview Kyle Cooper and also Alexis Martin Woodall, who is the executive producer for Ryan Murphy Television, and she's the creative producer on American Horror Story, and they do a real deep dive into the process for creating the first 7 seasons of opening credits. It's amazing.
I feel really naive, but it never occurred to me that there would be someone to specifically design the opening credits, and that would be someone's job.
I have to be honest, that is a dream job of mine. I'm a big fan of opening credits in movies and TV. The design of them, the editing of them, the music. It's honestly, especially with American Horror Story, it's one of my favorite parts of every single episode. I just think it's fascinating. But yeah, Kyle Cooper is at the top of his field of title design.
Well, and even in my personal experience of just watching American Horror Story, like those opening credits create the distinct sensation of being on edge that just introduces you to the show. Where I feel like without those opening credits, and I feel like I probably even, as I was watching American Horror Story for the first time alone in my dorm room, probably opted to skip over those credits just because I couldn't handle like the accentuated fear that I do. I was already going to have to witness some things that I wasn't prepared for. I didn't need to be, as sound design does, just kind of like pushed a little bit further into that, because it's just even now, we're 10 seasons later, I'm still like, oh, the hairs on the back of my neck. That's incredible.
Well, I think with that is about all the time that we have for this week. Thank you for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed learning about the American horror genre and the horror industry that inspired the genre of American horror. If you like what you heard this week, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
You can also find us on TikTok at Filthy GD Horror Show, Instagram also at Filthy GD Horror Show, Twitter at Filthy GD Horror, and YouTube. You can also email us your questions and suggestions at filthygdhorrorshow@gmail.com.
While you're at it, please consider donating to the charity that we featured this week. Links to that charity can be found in the episode description and on our website. The show isn't sponsored by this or any other organization. We just like to shout out good people who do good things.
Now, if you haven't watched the 3rd episode of the new season of American Horror Story, this is the end of the podcast for you. Otherwise, stay tuned for our reactions to Double Feature. And tune in next week where we'll be exploring episode 4 of American Horror Story Murder House on...
It's a filthy goddamn horror show.
American Horror Story, Season 10, Double Feature, Part 1, Red Tide, Episode 3, Thirst. Go, Mo. Tell the people what you think.
I am just processing. There's something that was already innately so sinister about Alma, and these pills have just emboldened her or let that touch of darkness grow exponentially.
Yeah, we spoke previously about some of her unhealthy obsession with her art form, but yeah, there was always just like a little bit of a coldness and like a dark streak to her where something seemed off about her. She was one of those classic horror movie kids where she's just like a little strange. And yeah, it seems that the pill is bringing out some of those qualities, which makes sense because it also brought out some of Harry's bad qualities too.
This episode really pushes some boundaries, some limits and expectations. You know, in the first third of the episode, we see Harry get into a very precarious situation where he is forced to be about to be forced to be in a sex snuff film.
Yeah, let's talk about that entire sequence because that got real dark and then it kept getting darker and darker and darker, and I feel like that's one of those moments that American Horror Story has every season where there's always one scene where you're like, did they go just a bit too far? Like the nail gun scene in Cult.
Oh yeah.
There are equivalents in every single season, but there's always one scene where I'm like, guys. And this is the one where I was very shocked. I mean, it was terrifying. It didn't end up being as awful as it could have been, but it's still pretty terrible.
Well, and that's what they do, right? They get right to the point where you as a viewer are on the fence. Like, man, they could go through with it at this point. Like, it still could happen. Like,
yeah.
With Harry in the situation, I was like, man, they really, like, it could.
Mm-hmm.
I should mentally prepare myself for the possibility. And that's just what they do, right? They get that anticipation up. But wow, how the tables turned for Harry in that situation.
Yeah. I guess when I originally thought that he didn't actually take the pill. When he first reached up to his mouth, I thought he was taking the pill out from under his tongue, but then I realized he was taking his prosthetic teeth off to expose his sharp teeth so that he could bite through the ropes, which means he did take the pill. So, like, 40 minutes after committing murder, Harry's just gonna pop a boner.
And it's not gonna go away.
No.
Oh. It's a Filthy Goddamn Horror Show is created by Monique Quistorf and Nathan Skethway. Nathan also edits and mixes our show.
To find out about the music used in this episode, check out our website at filthygdhorrorshow.com. It's a Filthy Goddamn Horror Show is a podcast created by American Horror Story fans and is in no way affiliated with the show.